Happy Friday afternoon, everyone. I'm Zach Keeney, joined by Matthew Fish, and we welcome you all to another MSP Cyber Roundtable. If you haven't already, make sure you check out last week's webinar on YouTube. We had Ian Richardson from Richardson and Richardson Consulting on for a conversation around conquering cyber price objections. If you're new to the roundtable this week, make sure to check out our educational video library on YouTube and like us on LinkedIn. Today, we have Steve Alexander from MSP-Ignite and Chris Johnson from CompTIA joining us to discuss what makes up actual true cyber victories versus things that just look kind of shiny. We'll do full introductions in a moment, but first, how's everybody doing?
It's Friday.
It's definitely Friday.
It's Friday afternoon too.
So right.
Anyone who was here last week got to see the photos of the tree that speared my house and almost killed us all from a storm. The update is they extracted the tree, and I apparently get a whole new roof. So that's pretty.
Did
exciting.
You keep any of the wood chippings?
It's.
You should have kept all of them. You should have made that tree.
I'm gonna mail you a piece.
Oh, please. I'll make a little necklace out of it.
Yeah, or a clock, just like counting down.
Oh, that would be nice. You could turn the thing into something special.
That's right. You get the Fort Mesa, like put the torch the logo on it and give that out as a prize. Like you could have had this land on you. Yeah.
I'm gonna sell slices with the Fort Mesa logo.
That's right.
There you go. That's good. Steve, I forget, where are you joining us from?
Today I am joining you from Chicago. I'm from New York, but I'm traveling still this week.
Are you a fan of the Chicago area?
I love the Chicago area.
As a New Yorker?
It is the second city for a reason. And it's still my favorite second city.
You think it's second above LA?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay.
Exactly, Zach. That's exactly where I was going.
Fair enough.
That's Louisiana.
CJ, what about you? Remind me.
I am in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, about 30 minutes west of the Mississippi River.
Okay. All right.
Zach, I should share that since you guys can all see it, that evidently Navy is up 14-7 over Memphis on ESPNU right now.
Nice.
Good. No one has to switch channels. They can just look over your shoulder.
For those that are acutely interested in that game.
Steve, where's your money? Where's your money riding?
Neither one of those two teams.
Awesome. Well,
it's not often that you can do picture-in-picture on a show like this.
Yeah.
We're really bringing it to the viewers.
That's right.
Well, guys, we're really glad to have you. Why don't you guys do brief introductions before we jump into today's control?
Chris, go ahead.
Steve. Oh, man.
Most gentlemen.
I beat you to it.
Okay. So I actually have been on this show, I think, once before. So those of you that don't know, my name is Chris Johnson. CJ, as I'm now called at CompTIA, and I run the cybersecurity compliance programs for our membership, which is also the cybersecurity trust mark. So it's one program. And I've been in the cybersecurity space for about the last 12 years, give or take.
Awesome. Well, thanks for
Cool.
being here.
And I'm Steve Alexander from MSP-Ignite. I run a peer group for MSPs. We do have a focus on cybersecurity through an initiative called Secure Outcomes. It's run by someone many of you may know. I never called him CJ before, but Chris Johnson actually runs that for us as well. So we have a good partnership going with CompTIA.
I was member number 3 for MSP-Ignite peer groups.
11 years ago, I think that is.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
That would be 3. We have 130 today. Something like that.
That's awesome.
Founder.
Well, I'm Matt Fish. A lot of you already know who I am. Founder Fort Mesa, helping you own that cybersecurity roadmap at your customer. It's interesting. You're counting the years since you've been in cyber, and I'm trying to think, when do you start counting? Is it like the first hacker battle? Is that like?
I mean, I guess in fairness, I could have gone all the way back to when I assembled my first, wireless sniffer, but like,
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
think so.
So that would have been 2006.
So I may have you by a couple of years there. So in my teens, I ran a web hosting outfit that got hit by. This might be hard to believe, but there was a day before there was distributed denial of service,
Right.
and then someone invented it, and they took down eBay and Yahoo all in a 1 week period. But before they did that, they took me down.
Nice.
And half of Canada went dark, and I got kicked off my ISP.
You were part of a pilot program.
I think I get this. I think I get to start the clock then.
That's awesome.
All right, I'm gonna date myself for you guys just because it's a funny story related to this topic. Back in the early 90s, before any of you were doing this, I was on a bus from one location to another during Comdex in Las Vegas, and I realized that sitting right across from me was Peter Norton. D Norton. So I proceeded to ask him how he came up with the concept of convincing people that there was a virus and they had to buy software. He actually got so frustrated he got up off the bus in the middle, like we're in the middle of driving to a location. He got off the bus, and everyone around me said, "I don't think he appreciated that." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm getting that. I'm getting that now. I understand now."
That's awesome.
Zach, you want to do a quick one? Then we'll jump into the control.
Sure. Zachary Keeney, co-founder and director of sales at Fort Mesa. Prior to my time at Fort Mesa, I owned a restaurant franchise and have some extensive experience in management development, people development, and process development in organizations. So I guess my cyber clock started at Fort Mesa. So I'm coming up on a year. I'm a baby.
Yeah, baby, but you've been studying, right? So
studying hard.
You can go far fast if you try.
Oh yeah.
All right, we're gonna jump to it. So with that. So today's control that we're just going to spend 5 minutes on before we get into topic of the day, CIS Control version 8, Control 5, account management. The account management domain at CIS has 6 subcontrols. They are on 3 maturity levels. The first 4 controls, and I'm going to cover those first. CIS, the Center for Internet Security, says that every organization, whether they're small mom and pop or a large enterprise, should have these things in place. So in terms of secure account management, the very basic is 5.1, maintain and establish an inventory of accounts. So make sure you have a list of all of your users. There may be accounts that are not just users. So it may be service accounts as well. We'll get down to that in a minute, but make sure that you have a list of all of your users' accounts. And this gets particularly challenging if you have more than one user directory, or you have devices that are not connected into a user directory, because then you have system A and system B with different lists of users. You're going to save yourself a lot of energy there if you can consolidate through a directory federation.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd love to ask a quick question on that, and you may be getting into it, but what if I'm an organization that works really closely with other organizations, and our systems and our people either integrate in some way or go between platforms in some way? How would that fall into this type of situation on 5.1, and or would that be addressed later in this control?
Yeah, I mean the simplest method of consolidating accounts through federation is to connect all of the systems in a single company together, a single organization. But it's even better when you're communicating with another organization in a secure fashion, your identity follows you. And you can do that through a cloud directory. Google and Microsoft both sell solutions that are quite popular there. In fact, they've got a free tier. Both of those products have free tiers. Okta is, of course, the number one enterprise solution for this, for carrying your federation with you to other companies. And you don't necessarily need to buy something expensive. It is just a process where you set up that identity exchange between you and that other company. But ideally, if you're receiving users from another company, they're also users in your systems, and you should be tracking those as well. 5.2, unique passwords. Use unique passwords. The idea here is just that your users are not using the same password in multiple places. It sounds simple. It's incredibly difficult to enforce. Making sure that your user is using a unique password that they're not using in another place is quite difficult. You need to do a lot of training. You can use some technology tools there, but particularly, I'm not a big proponent of dark web scanning, particularly when it consumes budget dollars. But there's some free services and tools out there that will just scan those dark web data dumps and see if a password that your user is using is being used someplace else on the internet. And if you get hit there, there's a sure indication that your users are not using unique passwords. So they should be retrained or censured if that happens. 5.3, disable dormant accounts. Most control standards say 30 days. If you don't log in for 30 days, your user account should be disabled and the user should have to ask to get back in. There's a bunch of reasons for this. But ultimately, if people don't need access to something, they shouldn't have it. You certainly don't want you don't want your systems breached because someone, left a password that was not important to them laying around on an account that they didn't use for a long time. Another user takes over that account and your user doesn't even notice because someone has stolen that account. So disabling those dormant accounts is good. It'll protect both the takeover, but it'll also protect against people just having more access than they should, or employees that leave your organization and no longer should have access. 30 days is a great target, but doing it at all, is really what they're asking for here. Go ahead.
Why does this one stand out as respond against the others that are protect and identify? And we see protect and identify a lot more often than we see respond.
Yeah, it's because it's an actual action you're taking. So the detection would be find the dormant accounts. The response is to actually doing something about it.
Yeah, that goes back to 5.1, right? Like if you have the inventory, you should be able to see that there are accounts that feasibly should be disabled.
Ideally, you're looking at last logon dates, right?
Right.
And that's what we do in our company. I just sort by last logon. If someone's not logging in, they're out of there, right? They get disabled. There's tools to do this too. And if you're a service provider, you probably want to get one of those tools. 5.4, restrict administrator privileges to dedicated admin accounts. Everyone complains about this one, right? What this means is super user privileges. To do anything that's beyond what a normal user would do should be a totally separate user account. I have 2 user accounts for Fort Mesa. One's a super user account, one's my personal account. My personal account, despite the fact that I'm both the CISO, CTO, and actually also the CEO, and I have high level access to things. My user account is not particularly well endowed, right? I'm just a normal user, and I have to go switch contexts, use a secure workstation, and log in with that super user privilege if I'm going to do something super usery. And this is so important. This is probably, in my opinion, this is the most important intervention on the sheet. Because if I wanted to break into a company, I'd go straight through the super user.
You know, it's funny that we're going through 5 without doing 6 almost at the same time, because you've got 2 of these in here that are foreshadowing for what comes next, and you're kind of touching on them a little bit, but like 5.4 is a good example of you get to deep dive that on your next control.
Wait, is that the dedicated admin workstations?
No, so Control 6 is access management,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
So
right.
like you're getting into like privileged access and understanding roles and responsibilities within those permissions, where you might limit someone geographically even in their privileged account, like that. Hey, you're in Dallas or New York or wherever it might be, and you can't see anything outside of that region.
Yeah, and one could argue, this takes up a couple domains in CIS. One could argue that maybe they need more attention here, because if we look at the, like the Verizon breach report for this year, I think it was definitely the most common attack pattern. It was something like half of the attacks. The initial opening vector was account misuse, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
if you want to stop half of the possible cyber attacks, right, it's do
Right.
a good job at access control and access management, right? Which,
Well, in my previous life, you would have, you had accounts that were able to do different things. You had, I guess I'll elaborate. The franchise that I owned was a pizza franchise. So you had people that had next to no privileges that needed to do nothing, and those were generally minimum wage employees or tipped employees. And then it scaled all the way up to high level employees that oversaw many units, and then you had everything in between.
Right.
If you were to lose one of those mini unit people and they were to have access at a really high level, and that were to fall in the wrong hands of, the wrong team member, or, the wrong not team member that knew how to use it, that would be a bad situation.
Right.
So just to kind of give the other side of it, the context of what it would look like and what this looks like from a business application perspective.
so Mike's asking a question here, and is that still the case when you look at Microsoft is doing with privileged access? I there's a few features there that come to mind, but I do know that we had someone on a few weeks ago that was talking about this, and I think Microsoft is embracing the zero trust methodology, although they're not calling it zero trust, right? And I would say that probably what we're going to see in a future CIS framework at some point is CIS is also embracing those things and saying, yeah, you need to be doing zero trust. But I don't think any of those technical advanced context based access management things, about around escalating privilege or determining whether someone should have access under a certain scenario. I don't think those are replacements for this. I think that you absolutely need to have dedicated accounts with a different username, and I think you'd absolutely need to disable them when they're not in use. And Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
I think not only that's important, but I think we actually talked about this the other day. I was talking about this with another solution provider, that we've gotten lazy over the years with account creation. And so you often will see things like where a user might be fill in the blank vendor backup, right? That's the username. And you're in there looking at this like, hey, it's probably an account to disable. And you're like, but is this the actual account used to do the backup? Or is this when we need to engage support, to get on the account to figure out why something, for troubleshooting, that kind of thing. Then you're like, well, then what should I do with it? But if we put descriptors in, which I think we've not done well as an industry over the years, we've certainly not doing it as well, I guess is what I would say. And I think that's where this comes into play too. What are the privileges? If it's not a privileged account, it might not be nearly as big of a deal. But if it's privileged, oh my word, like disable and find out what the repercussions are.
Yeah, and Mike's clarifying here. He's talking specifically about privileged identity management.
Got it.
It doesn't matter, because the reality is, if you're doing SSO, if you're doing consolidated user directory management, even if Microsoft has some escalation policy in there, or escalation constraints or controls, compensating controls, you're using that identity following you everywhere on the web. And if you have an important piece of SaaS out there that's not integrated in with like that privileged identity management, your identity is still going to be stolen. That super user privilege. It really, I think it should be a separate PC, separate or a separate virtual machine, like a separate hygiene environment, right? It should be a separate user account. And you need to be really careful with those. And I would say that those privileged users are probably at a much higher standard. So for me, I have to plug in for my normal user identity. I have to use a multi-factor authentication step with a hardware key, and I'm allowed to trust that for a period of multiple days before I have to re-authenticate again on my normal PC, right? Or on my browser. That trust is held for multiple days. With my super user privilege, we've set that anytime I want to do anything, I have to put the key in, right? Like within
And it
minutes.
probably gets flagged.
Yeah, and we're monitoring it in a different way, right?
Right.
So, Microsoft's doing things, lots of vendors are doing things, but it's so easy just to make another account and solve all the problems. And then we got Dominic here noting that he's a fan of the privilege admin workstation too. That was the end of 5.1 through 5.4, which those are the things that every organization should do, whether they're a car wash or a bank. Okay, all 4 of those things. There's 2 more that Center for Internet Security says are for organizations that have specialized applications. Maybe they're a little bit larger, maybe they're regulated. And any of those more mature companies should also be inventorying service accounts, not just user accounts. And they should also be centralizing their account management. And we hinted at that, right? That's what we're talking about, federating, that you only have one user directory. You shouldn't have applications with their own user accounts, servers with their own user accounts, even switches with their own user accounts. Everything should roll up to a directory. Before we move on from account management, Chris, anything you want to add?
I will just say that when you're handling this control, and this is why CIS groups 5 and 6 together, you may find yourself in sort of a recursive loop for a while as you go from this one to 6 and back again, addressing your account management.
Yeah. Unfortunately, security is all tangled together, and we try to break it down into domains to make it easy to understand, but it's a hairball. All right. So, topic of the day, guys. I got a special background, but here you can see the whole background.
It's shiny.
Here. Yeah, it is shiny. It's something to talk about. So let's talk about that So Shiny story, right? I talked to a vendor that's, they're an MSP. Sorry, and they're not like a software vendor. I talked to an MSP, and they say, hey, how do you compare to this product I'm spending $12 a user on? And I say, well, I don't think you need that product. You're not doing basic security interventions. That's actually the stuff that you need to be doing. And you don't need to buy any products for that. You just need to do the stuff. So this is like the root of the mentality that I see. And I don't, you guys have any like horrible, like shiny object syndrome, like stories that you've encountered?
I mean, Steve can tell you I am the definition of shiny object syndrome. I was often berated, slapped, made to buy rounds of beverages at the bar, solely tied to the fact that I like to buy a shiny object. I got a good deal at a show. It was something that we were made aware that we need. But I think to your point, this is I am not unique to having this problem. I was just very vocal about what I was doing, which made me be the brunt of the joke, if you will, with maybe others not being so quick to admit their own vice with shiny objects. So Steve can probably elaborate better to that, because I don't think this has anything to do with security.
Well, it doesn't. It has to do with the fact that most MSPs are geeks at heart, right? Most are techs. They started as techs. They're looking for the latest thing to try, to break, to use, to implement, to give away to their client. Never sell, of course. Just give it away to their clients. And the interesting thing is, we can tie the lack of growth in business to the number of shiny objects implemented each year, right? We can just tie the two together. and say, yes, you will ignore your business, but you will keep bringing new tools to your clients.
That's
I hadn't actually thought about that correlation, but the energy's got to go somewhere. It's either going into growth or
Exactly. Exactly. We always try and tell our members that we have to remember that when you go to a conference, the people working the booths, including us when we're all there, right? We're salespeople. And that moment, we are salespeople, even if we wear other hats. That's our job. We're going to do it to the best of our ability. Your job is to remember that you own a business. You're not there as a buyer's agent for your company. You own a business. And we always say, if someone presents a tool that fills a void or a hole that you didn't know you had before you walked in the room, perhaps you should slow down a little bit before you just buy it and make a commitment.
So Dominic's got an example here, which I'm gonna highlight this just because I bring this example up every time. So I talk about this frequently about how security is like 2/3 people in process. I think all of IT is 2/3 people in process, right? And so the customer says, I think I need detect and respond because it's on my insurance form. And the service provider says, okay, we'll get you that EDR, MDR, whatever, right? But they don't carry it through to, oh, wait, there's actually supposed to be an incident life cycle around this,
Right.
okay, the EDR had a detection. That isn't just it goes into your email and you ignore it or not, right? And even if you don't ignore it, that doesn't mean you just log into the machine and like uninstall the thing. There's a notification list. You need to have a triage protocol. You need to determine, is there bounds to this incident, right? What's the impact? You need to document that all, communicate it to whatever the stakeholders are, and then you have to do your after actions, right? And if you're not doing all of that incident lifecycle stuff, you're not actually doing detect and respond. All you did was you used up however many dollars per endpoint for a shiny object, right?
I think this goes to what Dominic said. It almost is the cart before the horse, right? So I think shiny object syndrome, the challenge of it is less of buying shiny object and more of why are you buying shiny object? Because if you've determined that in order for you to fully satisfy a safeguard, like the one even that we talked about, requires you to purchase something to help you get there, fine, great. That's obviously, a good use potentially of your financial investment so that you're not doing this, just consuming FTE to get it done. But if you don't have an idea of what the outcome is supposed to look like before you start evaluating tools, this is the age-old saying of when you hear that, hear the water running in your toilet, you're like, do I go check it out and investigate myself, or do I just call a plumber? Well, what if it's just as simple as like the flap?
The chain fell off.
Yeah, the chain fell out, or any number of things, right?
I know my toilets.
Right. And the answer could be like, well, I didn't do that, so I called the plumber, and the plumber's like, well, based on the trouble or the sound that you're hearing, we often see that we need to replace the floor, we need to replace the sink, and we're probably going to also have to replace the toilet. But at that point, you're like, wow, this sounds really serious. How soon can you get over here, right? And now I've bought into whatever the plumber might be selling me because they've identified a problem I never knew I had, whether it's real or not.
Yeah, they're manufacturing the stress.
So the EDR, MDR, I don't want to say it in itself is a shiny object, but it can be that way if you don't actually put it into a process, right? So what are those other shiny objects that people just latch onto and maybe don't derive business value from or revenue from? I think like the list in my head is like a mile long, but the cyber ones that I see, it's EDR, MDR, right? There's the logging systems that people implement, but they don't actually make sense of their logs. They just like dump random logs into it and then
any of the scanning tools, any vendor that provides scanning is a dangerous slippery slope.
Right.
When you say slippery slope, elaborate there.
So I would start with, if you don't have a plan, this goes back to what was said earlier about like, well, if you're not going to do anything about it, you're just going to kick it into an email or an alert on a PSA board and ignore it, then it's self-defeating in some respects. But it's also a dangerous double-edged sword too, because if you're not doing anything with it, but you're having it happen, then when the, bad things happen, ignorance is not bliss, right?
It even goes to, we hear all the time from our members, this is a better tool than the last tool because it integrates better with my PSA. And then later, in the conversation, they talk about, well, the biggest problem we have is we have 657 open tickets in our PSA.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're clearly not looking at any of these things. It's great that they have an integrated solution, but as Chris was saying, they're not doing anything with it.
So
Tuning requires work.
We have a PSA integration with just about any PSA you could think of, and it's a big part of our value prop. And when it's used the way we recommend it, it creates a lot of business value, which is a user's in our dashboard and they decide something's actionable and they want to assign it to another technician that's not them. They shoot it to the PSA and it gets triaged. We also end up with people, and this is not a single partner that I've heard this from. This is many partners I hear this from. They say, because one of the things we sell is a vulnerability management tool, they say, can we just send them all to the PSA? Like, we find 1,000 vulnerabilities on one machine,
Right.
and they want to see them all automatically in the PSA. And I'm like, that is going to be a horrible life for your PSA and for anyone that has to like deal with those tickets. You're not,
Look at
Well,
that
the reality
ticket
is no
number
one
jump.
will, right?
Yeah.
The reality is no one will deal with them. They will just sit there.
yeah. So
Or they auto close them.
yeah.
Much
That's
better.
even
Much better.
I think there's an element to the shiny thing syndrome that is related in recognizing that there's a problem, wanting to do the right thing and solve it, but for whatever reason, maybe you don't have enough attention to solve it. Maybe you're scared that you aren't knowledgeable enough to solve it. Maybe you've been fooled into thinking it's simpler than it is to solve it, which is the worst one. Like, shame on anybody doing that.
Right.
Any of those reasons, you might be spending money for the right reason, but in the wrong way. So, I mean, for those types of folks, what do you recommend?
Well, so there's one thing that comes to mind with what you just said. I think that, like, even to say kicking it into your PSA, it's not necessarily wrong. It's not as, I mean, yes, it could be information overload, but the reality is sometimes it's not about what you're going to do about that particular alert. Maybe, like you said, there's 1,000 of them, but you scan through them, like, you recognize real quick there's 4 or 5 that you can fix. And you fix those 4 or 5. And then all of a sudden you realize, wow, it got rid of like 900 of those alerts because of the one thing I did do. So I think sometimes things like risk registers, they get misused, kind of to like what you said about dumping it all into the PSA, which gets into that whole like action management strategy. And I think if solution providers were spend a little bit more time and energy on how do we take this mass amount of maybe noise, look at tuning it, but then more importantly, think through the things that are in there. They're like, oh, wait, let's put this into our actual PSA as tickets to be assigned for the to-do, and then let it kind of cascade, right? Because I just saw one the other day. It had to do with an Apache vulnerability. So the host has 15 plus vulnerabilities from ranging in from going to get exploited to low. The fix for all of them, patch Apache. Like, it's one task, right? One action item, not 14 alerts being pumped into your PSA to address 14 times in someone's daily duties.
Right. Yeah, and that's why we recommend someone pushes tasks from our platform. Although we do, for some of our, we do allow long-term schedules of tasks that are very pointed and they're based around business value, and we certainly schedule those as being automated. You know, another one that it hurts my heart sometimes is and I don't want to pick on a vendor, but the penetration test sale, right? The customer comes to you as a solution provider and they say, I think I need a penetration test. For whatever reason, that term sticks in people's brains and it gets all amalgamated with other risk terms like risk assessment or threat model, right? Vulnerability assessment, scan. They all get lumped up, and in the uninformed buyer's mind, they're all under the category of penetration test. But the reality is, the penetration test is literally the last thing you're supposed to do as security. CIS, that has 18 different domains for all the things you should be doing technically in security, lists penetration tests the absolute last thing you do after you've done every other thing. They have literally 140 something other things before you get down to pen test.
Well, and I think that's another great correlation to somebody thinks they're doing the right thing, right? They're like, oh, penetration test. That's like, that's the Cadillac, right? That's the top. But they haven't taken the time. They're ready to spend, but haven't taken the time to understand. Like before, as a business owner, if you're getting caught into shiny object syndrome, it's because you haven't taken the time to fully understand what you are potentially about to spend money on. And if you have a bunch of tools that aren't being utilized effectively in your business, it may be because there's gaps in knowledge there that could be filled or need to be filled.
I think, I focus on the MSP space, right? And I think a big part of this is that the average MSP or even the average IT director in a corporation is not spending the time to explain to the decision makers the security standards they should be mapping policies to, right? So the whole point about pen testing being last, you know what the decision makers go? Oh, this way it'll tell us exactly what we're not doing. Even though if we're just tying things to some level of controls, we would have the list of things we're not doing without looking.
A 20-minute interview. Yeah, a 20-minute interview that I will give you for free will tell you what you're not doing.
Yes, exactly.
I think this is that value proposition that we run into all too often. And that is, well, what's the value if it's free? And surprisingly, if we were really looking at just going back to the beginning in CIS, if we were to look at that, I don't think there's any control that CIS addresses, at least at IG1, that they don't offer up a free tool as part of helping you achieve satisfying those safeguards.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that even into IG2, Chris, a lot of that stuff is baked right into tools that the service providers have to have. Like it's part of Windows.
Right.
It's part of whatever they've already deployed. You don't need to buy another thing. And there's this argument that, buying the thing makes the task easier. And not usually. Buying the shiny thing usually means you have to work harder.
Or someone does. Like I remember many cases when I had my MSP of leveraging products and services to limit adding FTE. And I think there were a lot of areas in our business that worked really, really well for us. Help desk was one. Some NOC services helped us, not have to add FTEs. But in the cybersecurity space, I don't think you can truly do that, because so many of them, you end up with all this information that it requires human intervention to reduce the noise. And we hear this all the time. Cybersecurity is say maybe 60-65% tools if we're lucky. The other 45% is human. And we always talk about someday we're going to get to 90%. I don't think that's true.
I'm floored that you put it at 65%.
Yeah, me too. I think it's more like 20 or 30.
Yeah. Well, if you think about, and I was Steve. I see Steve moving.
Chris went to 110% as a total, which nobody caught. So
well, he works really hard.
I bought all the shiny objects, people.
Oh, man. Well, I think it's a good point to be brought up in any case that I wanted to touch on. I mean, if you're thinking about, well, what is a cyber win and what is a cyber tool? I mean, the first thing is, well, what is cybersecurity? How am I defining what a win is? And well, what is cybersecurity? People, process, and the technology. You need the technology, because if you don't have the technology, then it's not cyber, and you're not needing to secure anything, right? So the technology is there on its own already, and we're using it as a part of our businesses. The people and the processes are using it every day. Your teams are the ones that are engaging with their accounts, engaging with the data, engaging with the other customers. I mean, that's all people stuff. And then the processes in your business, once you get that data, where does it go? What happens? Who sees it? What cybersecurity is, it's melding all three of those things together, because we're storing all that data and operating our businesses across technology. So how are our processes engaging in that? How are our people engaging in that? And from there, you may need technology and tools to help them execute. But if you're not thinking about it in terms of what are my people going to go out there and do, then you're looking at it from the wrong angle, in my humble opinion.
Well, so that's the practical argument, right? I think that, so here's the pitch, right? Does anyone have guesses on gross margins, like average gross margins on a shiny object? Anyone have guesses on like average / best gross margin you could expect? It's probably like the 10 to 30% range, right? It's sort of normalish.
I mean, Steve probably can answer better, but I would say that's not unrealistic.
Yeah, you want to be closer to 30%.
Yeah. And so what's the target gross margin on human labor? I've heard a lot of numbers here, but I think there's an industry target at around 50, and some people exceed that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you literally lose money every time you sell a shiny object instead of deploying your people.
So there's an interesting.
People are hard. Sorry.
There's a caveat to that. So we hear this saying a lot. You know, what does my tool do today that I needed to do? And is it doing it? I obviously bought it for a reason, right? Like, forget the shiny object. At some point in time, we do buy tools out of necessity, not out of sparkle, except for me, of course. But within that, you see something really interesting happen. The industry matures, right? And now instead of there being one tool, there might be 100 tools. And I think one of the things that we do really, really well as MSPs, sorry, not well as MSPs, is when there's a new product that appears to do something in the same category as a product we already have, kind of goes back to every year swapping out an EDR, is did we bother to check and see the product that we already have? Does it now do that too?
Yeah, well, I know that when I'm looking at like, EDR is the perfect example, right? You look at the standard and you look at what the requirements are, right? And then you look at like some shiny brochure and it's got like a million features, but
Right.
They don't actually relate to anything on the standard. And then the standard may come out with, okay, now we have this requirement, right? Now we've got 6 requirements instead of 5. And you look and yeah, every product on the market's doing that. You don't need to switch to the one with 400 features, right? To get that covered. You're right. It's every product every year, right? Where the marketing literature is always stuffed with features, right? That's how we differentiate from our competitors and why you should pay $5 instead of $4 instead of $3, right? It's the features which may have zero security value, right?
There's an element there also that needs to be considered, which is how efficient are your people with the tools that you have, and how much of the functionality of the tools do they know how to use / are we using? Because there may be tools that are doing things that are overlapping, which was already mentioned, or you may have tools that you're paying for functionalities that you're not using that you should be using, or you may have tools that you think your people are using to their full capacity that they don't even realize they're not even touching, which that's a bummer also.
So Daniel put this note in here, and here's the other one, right? The switching cost. Like you implement the new thing, and it costs like 400 hours to put into place, right? Or that gets quite expensive, right?
Yeah, I used to say that my RMM may come and go, but my PSA is here to stay. I don't know if that's entirely true anymore, but that statement came from understanding that RMM tools and PSAs, the two specifically, they're extremely difficult when you've invested years of custom scripting and integrations to other systems to just go, oh yeah, today I'm going to go from one vendor to the next. It doesn't bode well, both from the shift and lift that was just said, But good grief, think about what it does to your staff. Like that is not a positive reinforcement. That is what we call inflicting pain on your team.
So we just went down a gripe hole about like shiny object. Of course, I'm in the vendor space, right? So I'm doing my best to not sell on shiny factor, but I think you guys at wearing the MSP-Ignite hat, right? When you're working with your groups, right? When the best practices that you put in place, they're really tied back to that business value that's sellable, right? I mean, that's the focus.
I would say this, that's part of the focus. So we actually say two different aspects of reviewing any tool. There's the business aspect, there's the technical aspect. Those two should not come together until we've picked whichever one's going to go first, hopefully the technical, and said, let's make a technical case for why we think we need this. If we do, then let's look at the business case. How are we going to pay for it? How are the clients going to pay for it? Is it replacing something we already have? How are we going to make the lift in labor that we were just talking about to get it there? Because the funny thing is, I said earlier about somebody with over 500 open tickets, they'll address putting in a new tool before they'll address those open tickets. They'll just keep going, right? And saying, hey, here's another new tool. Let's stop what we're doing. Let's put this tool in on every customer we have, every seat we support. And oh, by the way, let's not really educate the client on what we did or anything or why we did it. And we'll get back to these tickets later. Well, that doesn't make a good business case at all when you really think about it. But someone made enough of a technical case to say, we got to do this right away. And unfortunately, there are vendors in this space that will just scare the hell out of everybody and say, you got to do this right away, right? And then there are vendors like you, Matt, that will go there and say, let's talk about your whole business and not just talk about what we do.
Yeah, I mean,
and there's not enough of you out there, right?
I try so hard not to make it up. We always start with the standard. We say, here's where like 100 really smart people sat down at a table and came up with a playbook based on best practices. Here's what they say. And yeah, we'll tweak it a little bit because you're a dentist office, or we'll tweak it a little bit because you're selling this government contract. But that best practices shouldn't be something that sound good or that came on a data sheet, right? They should be something that came from a working group or a committee, right? So what about when someone comes to you with a business case? They say, and there's different, like the cyber business case, right? Like, hey, I've got this, my customer's got this pressure point around cyber. They're going through this due diligence process. Is it common to start with the business cases and then go back into the technical? Because I know that's the direction I like to think if I can.
When it comes to cyber solutions, I don't think we should ever think that way. I think we should always think about the technical, the holes we can identify that we should be covering. Again, I'll say tie it back to some level of standards that you're following. I mean, how many MSPs even have an idea what their own security profile is and what they're trying to do with their clients? They really don't, right? They're going to the next show and going, oh yeah, we need that now too, right? But they don't relate it back to any plan they have. And maybe when you talk about the business case, that's what I would say, right? You have to have your own internal business in order for how you even evaluate tools, think about cybersecurity, think about how you present it to your clients. And if you do all of that, then evaluating new tools is a lot easier.
I'd like to add to that, because I think that there's another side to this coin. I think it's maybe not so much another side of the coin, but similar in nature. I had someone say, they can't do CIS. They're going to do CMMC because their clients are requiring them to do CMMC. And I asked the question, I said, well, what part of CMMC do you feel that you need to do first that you wouldn't be able to cover going through CIS? And of course, I didn't get a very good answer, because they basically made it clear they didn't understand either one. To them, it was about their business decision about aligning with a request than it was about aligning with security best practices and being able to show an effort that says, hey, regardless of which framework I choose to follow, I can still support you going after CMMC. I can still make changes to my organization to improve my posture, whether I do in fact choose to adopt CMMC, which kind of goes hand in hand to what Steve just said. But like, I think in the cyberspace, we spend a lot of time and energy worrying about what other people think instead of focusing on what we should do.
Yeah, and CMMC is the perfect example of something that it is not at all in conflict with CIS, right? Because what CMMC says is we want this much security, right? But in no particular order. And what CIS says is, well, actually, it's more important to do these things first because they're cheaper and take more risk off the table. But also, there's actually some prerequisites. You actually need to do this thing before you can do that thing, before you can do that thing. And if all you have is a giant pile of requirements, you may never get there. You may never be able to build it because you actually have to build a foundation before you build like a middle and a top, right?
Unless you're doing the modular assembly.
On the fly while the line's moving.
Helicopter the next piece in, right?
So with that, why don't we just wrap with some cyber wins? So we just talked about a lot of such shiny objects, and just like to close this out, I think that idea that we were just talking about MSPs that serve solution providers in general, they just don't have an internal plan, right? They don't have a plan. They don't, like, maybe it's all in their head and they think they're following best practices. The biggest win I see in those solution providers is when they move from pre-plan to post-plan, right? Once you've actually written down all of the security you're doing in one place, and then you've looked at all the security you're not doing, all of a sudden the plan just materializes.
A gap assessment.
It's yeah, gap assessment. That is like the biggest cyber win that I see. When those moments happen, it's like a light bulb moment. I always get so excited when I see that in a partner.
I agree. Steve, why don't you go ahead?
Cyber wins.
It's funny that Matthew picked that one. And speaking of wins, because some people
How's Navy doing?
Concerned. They're very concerned about the game. So I want to say it's 14-14 at the half.
Oh, it's a
and
hater.
Memphis is receiving the ball in the second half. That's important to someone. I don't know why. But, Matthew, when you were just before you started walking down the path, I was going to say, well, the most important cyber win is just to write down anything at this point. Like, decide you're going to have a plan that you put to paper. And that would be your win, because as soon as you decide to write something down, you will start to see where those gaps are. You'll start to realize, oh, wait a minute. We've got 4 tools over here that we've deployed to half a dozen clients each to test. We never took them out. We never deployed them elsewhere. They're just sitting there. By the way, 3 of them overlap each other. We're not even paying attention. I think the key here is to write down an inventory of the cybersecurity procedures and tools you're using, and then start to formulate a plan. So kind of the same way you went.
All right. So you can't do plan, Chris.
I know. So, I don't want to steal anybody's ideas here. I think there's a piece that happens that are similar to all the things that you've said. And that's very specific, that so many solution providers are afraid to start doing something. And maybe even they've started doing something. Let's just say it's, asset inventory as an example. And then they get wrapped around the axle, like, well, I still need to take inventory on this, and I still need to do this. And they're worried about, well, it's not 100%. Well, if you get to 100%, please call me, because I'll screw that up for you. I'll send you something in the mail so you have at least another asset to deal with, right? I think that we get
laptops.
Right. Yeah, I'm gonna send them an old laptop. Yeah, from inventory. And I'll put stickers on it that says sensitive data, please review. I think that's where we have an even bigger problem. We've got all these tools that help us do things like almost granular level inventory, granular level policy and procedure, right? And instead we're like, well, we're gonna make sure that that's dialed in, rather than recognizing, like, I have a pile of 10, and I'm gonna move on to the next control so that I can see progress. Because as you move forward, you will identify areas where, oh, wait, I need to go back and look at this again. But let the process trigger those events, rather than getting so wrapped around the axle to try and get it done all at one time.
Whew. Okay, so I think we all know that like the outcome matters more than the shape of the device that we buy or the shape of the software at this point, right? Like you gotta make the
Depends on
thing
what.
do
Object shapes can have big problems. I'm just gonna say.
Quick plugs here. Chris, what's the project you're working on? Give us the elevator here.
I am working on the cybersecurity trust mark for CompTIA. We are well on our way into group 2. We've got well over 50 MSPs participating today, and it's growing fast. We just onboarded. We now have onboards happening in multiple countries, and that's exciting. So this is something that's getting international recognition, and I think it's ripe for the solution providers today to if you're not on the wait list yet, please get on there. We're sitting at about 700 solution providers on the wait list, and we're working through that as fast as we can.
Awesome. Steve, give us the quick MSP-Ignite spiel.
You know, for us, it really is all about putting MSPs or service directors or general managers of MSPs together so that they can have these conversations with each other without the internal pressures of my company says we got to move forward on this or that or the other thing. So we are looking to add members. That's really the big thing for us, and put them in touch with people like you guys.
And I'm founder of Fort Mesa. We help solution providers own their clients' cybersecurity roadmap with governance, risk, and compliance, GRC, and vulnerability management tooling. Zach, dial us out here.
Sure, I'm going to give my cyber win though, because instead of my final thought,
glossed right past you.
I'm subbing out my final thought for what I think is the cyber win, and if I was to define one from the perspective of somebody that was in charge of security for an organization, and I'm thinking to myself, I know all the stuff that needs to happen, but nobody else knows, and they're not doing the things that I'm asking them to do because they don't think it's important. If you're that person, or if you experience that, a win that I think would be huge is figure out exactly the right way to communicate one topic to one person that you can get buy-in from. Start there, and that will help you begin to roll the ball down the hill. So with that, we're going to wrap up. Thanks for joining us. This is going to conclude another Friday at the MSP Cyber Roundtable. Be sure to like us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube for more educational content. Thank you so much to these two gentlemen for joining us, and what an awesome conversation today. Be sure to come back next week, where we're going to have James Abercrombie from Acronis joining us to talk about disaster recovery planning. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Is it weird to say that I'm excited about disaster recovery planning?
We love a good disaster. You nailed it last week, so nobody's surprised at all.
That's awesome.